Well, good evening. Dr. Cavin again here with you. We're looking today at students who are deaf or hard of hearing. This is out of chapter 8 from the Exceptional Students book. So deaf with a capital D. This refers to members of the deaf community and deaf culture. The deaf culture is quite different than any of the other disability categories that we have studied or that we will study, in that where most of the others are really trying to be integrated, many in the deaf community like their deafness. They are their own community, their own culture. So this deaf with a capital D refers to um, that whole idea. Um, in fact, they have debates among themselves as to whether to use cochlear implants or hearing aids or any of those other devices that now with modern technology can change the um, amount of hearing that some of these people have. And then you have the deaf with a small d. This refers to people who have significant hearing loss, but don't identify as the big D deaf. They're not part of that community or culture, um, except for the fact that they have hearing impairment. Hard of hearing refers to those with anywhere from mild to severe hearing losses, and probably these folks normally will use speech for communication, but they will need educational and technology support, and they may or may not identify with the deaf culture. Um, and it's, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but it's very individual. I worked with a girl at one point who uh, her mom said she was deaf, and she said no, she did the double H sound, which meant, sign, which meant hard of hearing. That she did not want to be thought of as deaf. She was simply hard of hearing, although she had very little hearing. A hearing impairment is also a medical condition which leads to hearing loss, and this is a term that's used in IDEA 04. Texas is actually in the process of changing over to use the word deaf rather than hearing impairment, because these people will tell you, I am not impaired. I don't have a disability. I just can't hear. And that's not an issue for some of these folks. So it's it's very interesting when you get into some of the debates, not only between the deaf and the hearing community, but also the deaf and the deaf communities, and the debates they have among themselves. Historically, they were denied legal and human rights, denied education and social interaction. And in the 1500s and 1600s, the Spanish actually began teaching communication skills to folks who could not hear. In the 1700s, in France, the first free public schools for deaf individuals began. Now, before that, if you were a wealthy person, you could probably get some education for your child if he or she were deaf. But if you were poor, yeah, forget it. In the United States, in 1864, Abraham Lincoln actually authorized the National Deaf Mutes College to grant degrees. They hired a man named Gallaudet to be the president of this college, the National Deaf Mutes College. Eventually, the name of this college was changed to Gallaudet, and still is a very active university at this time. Actually, the background here is a picture of a Gallaudet. It's probably maybe the only, but it's certainly the most famous of universities in the United States that does everything both vocally and using American Sign Language. During the late 1800s, there was an oralist movement that said, don't bother teaching them sign language or anything like that. They can make sounds, obviously, so let's teach them how to make the right sounds. In the 20th century, we had more of a move toward advocacy for protection of the individual rights and access to inclusion in schools and communities. Um, we have this whole idea of normalization that we try to use for everyone. Let's let them be as normal as possible, which has worked for most of the disability communities, trying to make them as quote normal as possible. But some of the deaf have really fought that, the big D deaf. So, what are the clinical definitions of deaf and hard of hearing? Well, this is based to a large degree on the type and degree of hearing loss. Remember, decibels measures the intensity or loudness of sounds, and frequency measures the cycle of sounds per second. Human hearing is between 20 and 20,000 hertz at the frequency. So that's between 20 and 20,000 cycles per second. Most speech actually occurs between 300 and 6,000 hertz. And this is one of those things that as you get older, your range that you can hear lessens. A number of years ago, they came out with some ringtones and things for phones that operated just around that 6,000 hertz level. I'm sorry, up around that 20,000 hertz level. And it was a pretty amazing phenomenon because kids could actually leave their ringers on in school. And when the phone would ring, all the kids would hear it, but adults wouldn't. I didn't buy it. I thought that's not happening. So I downloaded one of those quote ringers that I couldn't hear, and I had all my kids sit on the couch, and I told them, okay, when you hear this thing, raise your hand. And I got behind them, my kids. I'm talking my own children. I got behind them, and I would turn it on, or I'd pretend to turn it on, and they nailed it every time. So it became clear to me that they could hear something that I couldn't with my older ears, and my ears are even older now. So that is an example of how that changes over the years and through time and through the use of the ear. Speaking of the ear, there's a lot of little things in there that can get messed up. We always hear about the eardrum and the hammer and the different little bones in there, the stirrup. But there's a lot of other parts in there as well that things can happen to, and they just lose their sensitivity over time. And that's just with natural wear and tear. That doesn't even take into account damage. So when we talk about hearing loss, 0 decibels is the softest sounds that are heard by humans. Up to 20 decibels is normal hearing level, even if you've got a slight loss. 20 decibels is a very soft or low volume speech, what you might call your inside voice. So the loss of 20 to 40 decibels of hearing is what's considered a mild hearing loss. 40 decibels would be the sound of a fan. 40 to 60 decibels is what they consider moderate hearing loss. A 60 decibel is typical loudness of a conversation. You can get a decibel meter on your phone. They're free. I'm talking now and I'm seeing 60, 70, 73. So, you have a little decibel meter here, and it reads off what the decibels are. So this is something you can get for your phone. In fact, if you are around a lot of loud noises, which is why I loaded a company I used to work for, there were a lot of loud noises around, and we had to make sure that we were keeping people safe. I think you could probably see it there, how it's fluctuating around 63. Now it's freezing up. My internet's not very good today for some reason, but anyway, you kind of get the idea. Um, and you can download free decibel meters for your phone. Uh, a loss of 60 to 80. So if you think about the how loud I'm talking right now, if you, and certainly, I mean, you can change your volume on your device and it would certainly be different. But in normal talk, if you could not hear just a normal conversation with typical loudness, that's how much hearing loss you're talking about to be a moderate hearing loss. A severe hearing loss would be 60 to 80 decibels, and 80 is going to be your typical vacuum cleaner. You know, I was looking at dishwashers at Home Depot the other day, and a lot of them were in the 50, 54 range. If it got over 60, it was a cheaper dishwasher because of the noise level. So sound of a vacuum cleaner, you get to 90, and that's considered a profound hearing loss. That would be a motorcycle. I mean, you couldn't hear a motorcycle. And 100 decibels, that's like the sound of a semi truck going by. The other key at 100 decibels is that's where you start getting damage to your ears. And that has to do not with just how loud, but how long you're subjected to that. And again, it has not just to do with the decibel level, but also with the frequency of the noise. Okay, for some reason I've got a picture that didn't work here, but all it was a picture of an old Walkman. I wanted to throw a few stories in here about some students that I have worked with in the past. Davey was when I worked at Western Hills High School, it was the regional day school for the deaf, which meant that kids from all over this region would be bused to or drive themselves once they were older to Western Hills High School. So we had this large population of deaf kids. And Davey was a young man who, liked to be cool, and he liked to fit in with the others. And I would often see him standing out in the hall beside my classroom during passing period, and he'd have a Walkman in his ears, and he'd be, just going along to the beat of it. But when you got to looking, there actually wasn't even a tape. I mean, this was before that, even CDs. There wasn't even a cassette tape in this Walkman. It just was all for looks, and he was pretending to go with the beat to keep up looks. So lots of interesting things about the culture of deaf kids, and in some ways they really want to fit in, and in other ways they welcome. So I've already started, and I'll just keep on going, and I'm glad that you were able to make it. So when we look at types of hearing loss, we've got the sensory neural. This is caused by auditory nerve damage. Conductive, which is caused with the transmission of sounds. Mixed hearing loss is with the conductive and sensorial. So I'm sorry, sensory neural. That's what the neural part has to do with the nerve damage, and then conductive means that it's just not able to conduct or push the transmission. Sometimes people's ears actually work fine, but once it gets past the ears and it starts making the sound into these nerve impulses, then that's where the loss comes in, and that's what the sensorineural. the conductive is that the sound is not, going through the ear and through the eardrum, ear canal, all that. But so there's both of those separately, and then there's also mixed. So as we talked about when we were looking at the chart, a mild to moderate hearing loss is usually 26 or so to 70 decibels, and that would be considered hard of hearing. Profound is a loss greater than 70 decibels. When you move from those who are actually considered deaf to the deaf from the hard of hearing, you're looking at a 90 decibel or greater loss. So, if you think about, we said that a semi truck was 100 and motorcycle was 90. That's how much hearing loss there is. So there, with some people who are considered deaf, just like those who are considered legally blind, with some who are legally deaf, they still have a little bit of residual hearing, but that is minimal in one way, but in another way, it can make a huge difference, because that residual hearing that they have, if it's enough, then we can use hearing aids and other sorts of technology to actually produce that sound or amplify that sound, depending on whether it's a neurological or a conductive issue. Okay, I got one of those sneezes that stuck, so excuse me if I sneeze here in a minute. So what are the terms used to describe the age of onset? Congenital means that the hearing loss occurred at birth. Adventitious means that at some point, this hearing loss was acquired after birth. Prelingual is hearing loss prior to development of speech and language, and postlingual is hearing loss after the development of speech and language. People who are prelingual, they've lost their speech and language. They've lost their hearing before they develop speech and language, have a much more difficult time learning speech and language, where sometimes people who lose their hearing postlingually actually remember how to talk and how to make sounds and form words and all that kind of thing, and oftentimes have you almost don't realize that they are deaf. They can talk fairly normally. Under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, deafness means a hearing impairment that is so severe that the child is impaired in processing linguistic information through hearing with or without amplification. So that's important, that if you could actually correct this to the point that there's not a loss by amplifying it enough, then they wouldn't qualify as being deaf under IDEA. And again, with all of our other disability categories, this must adversely affect the child's educational performance. A hearing impairment means an impairment in hearing that is either, it could be permanent or it could be fluctuating. Some people have these disabilities where at times they can hear some, and at other times they can hear little to none at all. This adversely affects a child's educational performance, but it is not severe enough to include under the definition of deafness. So the prevalence of deafness and hard of hearing, it's about 0.11%. It's actually trended upward here lately. You can see this was a 2009, so the previous edition of our book. It's actually about 0.14 now in Texas. So, just over 1 in every 1,000 kiddos ages 6 to 21 is either considered deaf or hard of hearing. We always like to talk about the causes. I don't know why we dwell so much on causes, actually, because, we've got these kiddos anyway. And I understand why the big world is concerned about causes, but us in education, I I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time on it. It's not like the kids that we have, if we figured out what the cause of it was, that they're going to be fixed. It's kind of too late for that. We've got what we got, and we need to work with them. But um, it it is something that we want to look at to help work toward prevention of further deafness. So you can't always identify the cause of a hearing loss. Sometimes it's excessive noise, and a lot of times this loss that's related to excessive noise may be a temporary thing. Uh, I like to shoot. I like to hunt and those kinds of things. And if you're not wearing hearing protection and you shoot guns for a while, then you have some residual loss of hearing. Most of the time, you'll get most of that back. I'm not much of a concert goer, but if you go to concerts that are really loud, the same kind of thing can happen. That you actually lose some of your hearing for a while. So the causes, some of the causes of conductive hearing loss is abnormal. A cause is abnormality in the pinna or the bones in the eardrum. It can also be a blockage. There have actually been people who have thought that they were deaf or hard of hearing when it was just a buildup of wax that had to get in there, that had to get out of there. Perforated eardrum can cause conductive hearing loss, or otitis, the middle ear. As far as sensory neural hearing loss, these could be genetic syndromes like Usher syndrome, Pendred syndrome, or Waardenburg syndrome. And it can also be environmental causes of like other diseases like rubella, or other viruses that can cause hearing loss. Sometimes you hear about people that get a high fever and have lost hearing because of that. So in looking at cultural or possible characteristics of deaf students or those who have loss of hearing, we have the whole cultural characteristics. We talked about at the beginning that the deaf community is a very distinct culture that don't really necessarily want to be integrated into the hearing community. I heard a story about a deaf woman who had a son who was born, and the doctor started examining the ears and all that, and said, with a relatively minor surgery, your child can hear. And she said, I don't want the surgery done. And many people, it was even taken as this was a form of child abuse. But she said, deafness, that's what we are. We're deaf, capital D deaf. And they had no problem with that. They use ASL as a primary means of communication. They're actually, I think it's been pretty well settled now, but there has been in the past a real fight over whether to use ASL, which is American Sign Language, or to use signed English. In signed English, you actually sign every word. And in ASL, there are shortcuts. There are words that there are signs that mean phrases. And so you can shortcut part of that. But ASL is the primary means of communication among the big D, capital D deaf community. And these folks often do identify more with that community than any others or anything else. There are some people who are deaf or have a significant hearing loss, and they don't really identify as part of that deaf community. They're more integrated into society as a whole. Intellectually, there's not a significant difference in perception, learning, memory between hearing children and those who are deaf. What we do find is that many times they don't have the exposure because of their hearing loss, they don't have the exposure. And I've got a story about that that we'll get to in just a few minutes of their peers who can hear. Academically, their achievement scores are lower than for hearing peers, but assessment issues may affect these scores. Uh, you know, a kid who is hearing things that are going on around them all the time kind of picks up by osmosis. I mean, if you imagine you were sitting in school all the time and nobody around you was talking, you couldn't hear what they were saying, then you wouldn't have picked up a lot of what you've learned. I bet you've learned things from your peers just in overhearing things. Reading comprehension sometimes is lower. Again, the lack of vocabulary, written language can suffer. Mathematics, you know, speech and language, all of these things can suffer. These typically a student with a who is deaf or has a hearing impairment intellectually is capable. It just has to do with how much exposure and how much good teaching they're able to get. Speech and language, obviously, spoken language may be delayed. One of the first things that people check when they start realizing, when we talk about which of the sounds should be made at what age, when kiddos are not producing the sounds that they should be at the right time, one of the first things you hear about them doing is putting tubes in their ears to drain the fluid off to help them to hear better. So they always want to, check the hearing and make sure that they're hearing things okay. The theory there being that if you don't hear the sound, then you're going to have a hard time replicating it. So that spoken language may be delayed. They can attain intelligible and age appropriate speech. We used to use the term deaf mutes, thinking that if someone couldn't hear, then they couldn't talk. But those are really not related. They can talk, they can make noises. What we've got to do is teach them how to make intelligible, age appropriate speech. And that's a difficult thing. One of the ways I know if I am speaking correctly is because I hear myself. I can't even imagine what it would be like to try to talk without being able to hear yourself. So clearly, obviously, they may have language delays. And when we think about it, in a way, they're ESL. They're English as a second language. They're ELs. They're English learners. Their ASL may be the child's natural language. You've probably seen books or examples of baby sign. And it's amazing how early, how young babies can pick up sign language. So it's great for babies who can hear, but it's also great for babies who can't, that they can learn signs and can begin to use or being first to follow and then to make these signs on their own. And this can really help prepare the child for the later learning of English language skills. Socially and emotionally, there can be huge delays. And I want to kind of, excuse me, I want to demonstrate that by telling you about a girl that I worked with who was named Felicity. I actually had her in a math class and had I don't know, 4 or 5 deaf kids in this math class. And one day we saw them, all talking to each other. I knew a few signs, but I certainly was not fluent. I couldn't read it fast enough. And the sign language interpreter was busy working with some other kids. So this little group of kids, it was 3 boys and Felicity, and they're all sitting there working around this one table. All of a sudden, Felicity lifts her shirt up and just, shows them everything. And we jump over there and, try to figure out what's going on, get her away from the boys. and get an interpreter working with us. And what was going on, we found out, was that the boys were giving her a hard time, telling her that she was not a virgin. And she was trying to convince them, yes, I am a virgin. And they kept razzing her, saying, no, you're not, no, you're not, no, you're not. And finally, one of the boys said, if you're a virgin, lift up your shirt and prove it. And she thought somehow by raising her shirt, she was going to prove that she was a virgin. I started asking questions about this, and I'm like, has mom not talked to her? What's going on here? And I found out that the only communication that her mom had with her was that they could write notes back and forth. Mom never bothered to learn sign language. So she had picked up just a couple of very simple signs, but most of their communication involved notes left on the counter to each other. So I found that very sad, but it also was a big explanation of why she didn't understand what was going on. And the boys were able to take advantage of that. I mean, you can imagine if you've got a child that's that naive in these were sophomores in high school, how easily they could be victimized. So a very real concern. So how do we identify them? Well, we've talked about through the whole early childhood intervention thing that many kids are identified early on by medical professionals, and they start getting treatment, uh, educational help, services very early on, well before school age. Can do audiometric evaluations. This uses an audiometer that is a way to measure hearing. You may have, I'm sure all of us have been through those tests where, it'll tell you raise your hand when you hear a sound in one ear or the other, or they'll bring the tuning fork and they'll, have it behind you, and then it'll tell you raise your hand when you can hear it. They move it out there far enough, and you eventually hear it. So all of those kinds of evaluations can help to tell. Speech reception, speech discrimination testing helps identify the issues. And the hearing loss must adversely affect the educational performance for a child to receive services under IDEA. And we've heard that with every disability, so that's nothing new. Certainly it makes sense that would be the case, but I can't imagine how there would be a child who was not adversely affected educationally if they couldn't hear what was going on at school. So what do we do to teach them? Well, focus on effective communication. Certainly learning some signs is great, but a lot of kids will use a sign language interpreter, ASL interpreter. And when that's the case, the mistake that most teachers make is to talk to the interpreter. Okay, tell her she needs to do such and such. A good interpreter will say, you talk to her. And then you talk to the student, and then the student, then the sign language interpreter will interpret what you said. And then often you'll see the kid say to the interpreter, tell the teacher such and such. She's like, no, you tell the teacher such and such. And then the teacher will talk, and the kid will talk and sign, and then it will be interpreted back to you as the teacher. When I talked about that at Western Hills, it was the regional day school for the deaf. I was a soccer coach, and I had a girl on my team who was deaf, and she had a sign language interpreter that when we would have team meetings or whatever, that would go over and tell her what we were saying. Also coached JV football, and we had a kid who was deaf on the team, and every play the sign language interpreter would go running over to the huddle, interpret for the kid, and then come running back off before the play. So they can be very involved. They can have great social interaction with the other kids. The neat thing about being at Western Hills at that time is We offered ASL as a language, and so many of our hearing kids took the class and learned to speak and befriended um, many of the deaf. They were involved in every area of our school, from athletics to um, high academics and on and on. So all the way down to the special ed. So it can be a really neat thing. Literacy, you need to provide authentic experiences. You can read aloud if they have a device that helps them to hear, um, whether that's their own hearing aids, cochlear implants, or we're going to talk about some other technology where that's used only at school, where the teacher wears a microphone and the kiddos have these receiver sets that then go to their ears that just really amplifies what the teacher is saying. So if you have a child who has a hearing impairment, a loss of 40 decibels, then crank that thing up, amplify your sound 40 decibels. They should be able to hear you. You also want to work on vocabulary and comprehension. They're often not going to pick up words just from the ethos like normal kids do, because they can't hear those words. So work on vocabulary and comprehension. Use miscue analysis when they mess up. Figure out, okay, what they keep making this mistake. What's going on here? Science and math sometimes are problematic, but for others of these kiddos, because there's less language involved, they can do very well. Um, it's also interesting when you get into deaf studies and you start looking at people who have contributed great deals to society. If you're studying, history, or what people who are deaf now are accomplishing, and those sorts of things. And then certainly you need to work on transition preparation. What do they want to be when they grow up, and what accommodations are they going to need for that? What can they realistically do? One thing we find about all kids is they don't really have good realistic ideas of what they can do, or on the other end of the spectrum, they shoot too low. So that's why you really need to work with these kiddos with the prepping them for the transition. So some of the things that are used often are oralism. This is where you try to force them to speak. And, like we talked about, some people think that's really a good thing, and others are like, no, 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 don't do that. Speech or lip reading. I am a horrible lip reader. But if this is a skill that you practice, some of these people are great at lip reading. Now, we've got a real issue going on right now, though. Everybody's mouths are covered. They're wearing masks. And the first time this really came to my attention, I was working out at the ballpark where they were finishing up the construction on the new Ranger Stadium out there. And there was a person who came up who was, I don't know if they were deaf or hard of hearing, but when I started trying to talk to them, they were just shaking their head like they couldn't understand me. And they finally made me understand that they used lip reading. Well, I was wearing a mask and they could not read my lips. So if you were a teacher and you work with kiddos who are deaf or hard of hearing, you're probably going to need to get, either use a shield or get one of the masks that has the cutout and the transparent film there where they can see your lips. Who thinks of these kinds of things? Then you also have the whole bilingual biculturalism thing. They truly do speak more than one language. They speak ASL and English, and they're parts of two different cultures. They're integrated to whatever degree they choose to be integrated, but they are also part of that big D, deaf. ASL is American Sign Language, and it's a language unto itself. Finger spelling, I remember think I was in middle school when I learned, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and learned the whole alphabet. Actually got into the habit, because the teacher that we had for that said, you need to practice all the time, just practice, and got in the habit of just spelling everything with my hands, to the point my mom finally told me to quit. But finger spelling is only as effective as how good of a speller you are in the first place. But even when you're doing ASL or signed exact English, you still have to finger spell names. And my name's Cavin, so they would use that a lot. And then finally I said, make a sign for your name. And I don't know what it would be. So they came up with C on the shoulder twice for Coach Cavin. And that's what my name became, instead of having to spell out Cavin every time. Signed exact English. Signed English is just that. You have to sign every word that comes out of someone's mouth. And you can imagine how difficult that might be. Cued speech is where, and you'll see often with ASL and sign English both, if there are synonyms that have the same sign, a lot of times they'll make the difference by speaking the word, vocalizing the word, and then you have a combination of lip reading and seeing the sign for that word. And total communication is the idea that you teach all of communication. You help them hear as much as they can hear. You teach them to vocalize as much as they can vocalize, and you teach the sign language and the finger spelling, all of it, so that they have the ability to use all of these different types of communication. So how do we identify the least restrictive environment for each of our kiddos who's deaf? Well, it is based on communication, language, academic, and social needs. You got to look at the big picture. We're certainly not going to put all the deaf kids together because that's easiest. Yeah, it's easiest for us, but among the deaf, you're going to have the full range. You'll have kids with learning disabilities who are deaf. You're going to have kids who have an IQ in the intellectually disabled range who are deaf, while at the same time, you're going to have a kid who is able to do AP classes, even though they're deaf. So it would be a disservice of them to put them all together, say, okay, that's the deaf room. You want them to have the opportunity to go to general classrooms. And again, I've talked about Western Hills being the regional day school for the deaf in this area, but you get out to some of our smaller counties and even some of our regions that serve multiple counties, and there is a regional day school for the deaf that only kids who are deaf or hard of hearing go to. There aren't any hearing people there. So it could be special classes or schools. In fact, in Austin, there's the Austin School for the Deaf, or the State School for the Deaf, excuse me. And there's a state school for the blind there. They have, it's just a school of deaf people. They have football teams. They have cheerleaders. I was talking to somebody a while back whose school actually played against the deaf kids in football. And they said our boys dread that game every year because the deaf kids don't hear the whistle, so they don't know to stop. And it's hard to penalize a kid because he didn't hear the whistle, because he can't hear the whistle. So it can become a real issue. You want to use visuals, large size materials. You want to make sure that you're getting a lot of the same strategies that work for kids who are ESL, where you're visualizing using full language. You need to post everything. You can't just stand there and say, okay, here are the rules, but again, good teaching is good teaching. If you're going to have rules, these need to be posted anyway. Post transition times, post rules, post menus, use graphic organizers. the whole idea of learning styles is kind of going out of vogue. In fact, I've got a colleague that just, she would bristle if she knew I was using the term, but there is some truth to the fact that if one sense doesn't work very well, then another one might help make up for it. So some of these kiddos can be very graphic in as far as visual in how they perceive things. Practical issues. This isn't out of the book. This is me. I never thought about the fact that deaf kids are so loud. But man, they don't hear the noise, so it doesn't bother them. So, banging on the desk with a pencil or humming or singing or anything, it doesn't, they don't hear it. They're not bothered by it. So you've got to really watch that they're making a lot of noise if you've got a mixture of kids who are hearing and kids who are deaf. It can be very distracting for the kids who hear. It can be very distracting for you as a teacher. So the classroom gets crowded. If you've got a number of deaf kids in there, then they're going to come with an accompaniment of sign language interpreters. The other thing I didn't know is that the ASL interpreter vocalizes what the students sign. I'm sitting there in class one time, and there's this, sign language interpreter that I've known, and she's a great lady, and all of a sudden she blurts out a cuss word. I looked over at her. What is wrong with you? What? Are you okay? And she pointed to the kid, and she said, he said it. He signed it 3 times. I told him if he signed it again, I was going to voice it, and he did, and I did. Well, she wasn't even supposed to do that. She wasn't supposed to give him 4 opportunities. She's supposed to, vocalize it the first time that he made the sign. So then you have, that to deal with. Parent communication can also be a nightmare, and I've got a story about that we'll kind of close with in a little while. I will tell you, it's way better now than it used to be. The advent of texting is huge. It's really helped in that area. But parent communication, by and large, is way better than it ever was before, in that parents can, log on and get kids' grades and kids' attendance and all that immediately. Some of the systems will send a warning to the parent immediately when a kid doesn't show up for class and things like that. So parent communication is much better than it used to be if everybody has access to technology. So speaking of technology, what kinds of instructional technology can be used? Well, hearing aids or cochlear implants. Cochlear implant bypasses the conductivity of the ear. It works with the neurological issues. It's often mounted right back here behind the ear, and then it actually puts electronic impulses straight from this device that's the receiver straight into the inner parts of the ear, the cochlea. And in that way, these sounds can be put into someone's ear or someone's head. Actually, probably I would consider it behind the ear, in the inner parts of the ear. And there are famous people that Rush Limbaugh, cochlear implants. Closed captioning. We're using Zoom. We can turn on closed captioning. At the school I'm teaching at now, they use all the Google Classroom stuff. You can turn on closed captioning and just immediately. Used to it was a big deal to get closed captioning. Now it's just not that hard. Telecommunication relay systems. There's a whole system for deaf telephones that was set up and operated for years and years and years. It still operates, where you use a special handset and the voice is changed over to electronic pulses that can be read. it's becoming outdated because of instant messaging and email. And certainly fax machines were a big deal, where you could see the messages instead of having to hear them. Again, fax machines are pretty well becoming outdated with instant messaging and emailing and scanning and all of that goes on. But lots of technology can be used and is being used to help kiddos who are deaf or hard of hearing. So special considerations for the general ed teacher. If you are a general ed teacher and you're going to have a student in your class who is deaf, utilize early intervention. Get on the problem early. Make sure that you're involving the parent. We want to really work on self-determination and self-advocacy skills with these kiddos. Sometimes some of them will tend to kind of lag behind and think that the teachers need to speak up for them, and we need to teach them to speak up for themselves. We need to really promote socialization through extracurricular activities and social skills lessons. They don't necessarily get the same social skills that other kids do, and they don't just listen around the room or look around the room. A lot of times if a kid does something stupid, then the other kids are going to straighten him up. Well, if you're the deaf kid in the class and you do something and everybody else, you can't hear what they're saying, you can't understand what they're saying, you're not going to pick up those skills. So those skills may need to be directly taught, just like you would directly teach an academic skill. Collaboration, working with teachers who know sign language or who are familiar with the deaf community can be a huge thing. We want to teach strategies to these kiddos. If you're going to read, okay, how do you interact with the book? Well, you get a book and you start, asking questions. And then as you ask questions, then you begin to look at vocabulary words that you might need. Some of the more difficult, maybe we would look those up before you try to read the passage, so you don't get to that word and you don't understand what it means and you get confused about the rest of the story. So make connections. I was reading this story the other day and it reminded me of somebody I know. Okay, that helps me make connections with those with the story. So you probably going to need to go back to some of those kind of elementary school reading strategies and teach those strategies. You also want to set realistic expectations. What can this child realistically do? And we talked about that. That's a big frustration with a lot of our kids with emotional behavioral disorders, is that the expectations are just not realistic. So we want to set realistic expectations. And by realistic expectations, I don't mean low expectations. I mean what this particular child can realistically do. Again, this is a matter of getting to know that individual student. You can't lump them all in there and say, okay, all deaf kids do this, or all deaf kids do that, or all deaf kids, it's a huge, huge range of people who are either deaf or hard of hearing. So this comes from a very real situation that we had. I call it the parent nightmare. And we'll call this kid Pablo. I don't use identifiable names of the kiddos. We're going to call this kid Pablo. Pablo was a friend of Davey that I told you about earlier, the one that sits there and jamming to the music that's not playing. And one day Pablo had decided that he had all he wanted. He was done. He actually decided that he was going to commit suicide at school. And he told Davey that he needed some help because Davey was tall. And they went into the boys' restroom there at the high school. And Pablo took his belt off, hooked it around his neck, and then stood up on the toilet and asked Davey to tie the belt across the bar there that held the stall walls up. And Davy helped him. And then he, thanked him for helping him and told him to leave. And he proceeded to step off of the toilet, and he was hanging there by the belt. Well, Davy, in typical deaf kid fashion, does something really stupid, but then goes and tells. And he thankfully went and told someone that Pablo was hanging himself in the bathroom. So some people got there and got him down before too much damage was done. We ended up having a parent meeting that involved the parent and many professionals, several teachers as general ed and special ed teachers, but also a school psychologist and the diagnostician. And when we got to trying to figure all this out, the student only spoke ASL. The mother only spoke Spanish. So what we had to do was somebody would ask the student a question. One of these people would ask the student a question. That would have to go through the ASL interpreter to the student. So this is going in English over to the ASL interpreter, then going to ASL to the student, who would then answer in ASL. The ASL interpreter would interpret to English. The Spanish interpreter would go from English to Spanish for the mom, and the English would go, straight across here to this group of professionals. The parent's answer would have to come back through the Spanish interpreter, either to the group of professionals or through the ASL interpreter to the student. So you can just imagine each thing that was said took about 3 levels of interpretation, and it just takes forever to have a meeting like that. It always bothered me how a parent can have a student, have a child, find out that child is never going to be able to speak your language, that if you're going to communicate with them, you've got to learn to sign, and then that parent doesn't bother to learn to sign. And I know, there are extenuating circumstances. In fact, in this case, the mother was, they were poor, and the mom had to work all the time. She didn't feel like she had time to take off and learn. And besides, if you don't speak any English, where are you going to learn American Sign Language? So it can be a very difficult situation. It can be a nightmare kind of thing. But thankfully for Pablo, we were able to get some things in place, so he was able to go ahead and finish school and did not. Any questions that anybody has before I go? All right. Well, y'all have a great night.